The basic way to understand Ukrainian history before the rise of the Soviet Union is to understand that Ukraine as a united country is very recent in Ukrainian history. So before 1917, before 1914, at the start of World War I, Ukraine is split between the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the west and the Russian Empire in the east. And before this, Ukraine was for a long time, Western Ukraine was part of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. Um, and it's a joke for us Eastern European historians about how, like, if you look at a map between 1700 and 1900, you see Poland disappear because Poland is split up three times by Russia, Prussia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Western Ukraine does not have a significant history with the Russian Empire, but Eastern Ukraine does. So Eastern Ukraine, thinking about Kyiv, further east of Kyiv, has been an important part of the Russian Empire. It was the grain basket of the Russian Empire, it was the grain basket of the Soviet Union, but also a key part of imperial Russian history as the Valuev Circular, which was passed in the mid to late 19th century or 1800s. And this prevented the publication of anything in Ukrainian. It didn't allow for the teaching of Ukrainian in schools. And so it was really reinforcing this Russian nationalist idea, which was Orthodox Christianity and Russian language and culture.
Can I ask you? I mean, so you said Kyiv west, but do you mean Kyiv east in terms of
Kyiv east? Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Kyiv
I got a little bit confused. And
Sorry.
And we should say, but when we say the breadbasket of Russia, it is because there's a tremendous amount of very, very fertile land there that is great for farming. What about Odessa at that point? Where is Odessa? Because this is, there's two things, right? That I guess, when you're talking about the 1800s and prior to that, that are super important in terms of resources, the idea of good farmland and then the idea of like a port. And so where was Odessa in that?
Odessa is the jewel of the Russian Empire. It was a key part of Catherine the Great's expansion of the Russian Empire in the mid to late 1700s. It is the most important port city in Ukraine, and it was a huge port for the Russian Empire. And so control of the Black Sea was also a key part of why when you see Russian imperial expansion to the south, why Odessa and Mariupol, Kherson, those areas in the south along the Black Sea are so important. So Odessa is not only economically important, it's very culturally important to Russian imperial history, particularly Russian Jewish history. So you have some later writers and Soviet writers like Isaac Babel, who comes from Odessa. His Odessa tales are famous because he had this like the gangster Binyuk. But Odessa is also one of the birthplaces of I forgot the word. So Orthodox Judaism it blooms in Odessa. So Odessa is very culturally important to Jewish history in Ukraine and in Russia. So one of the things so when you think about Eastern Ukraine, so Kyiv East, those are the connections you see to the Russian Empire. But a key part of this, besides the official repression of Ukrainian language, is that Odessa, Kyiv, Eastern Ukraine has always been multicultural and multilingual. And so when you have Putin saying Russian speakers in Ukraine are Russians, that's just him blatantly, painting over the fact that this has always been a multilingual country. When I was living in Ukraine in 2013, I only spoke Russian at that point, and I got along just fine. I was in Kyiv, I was in Odessa, I spoke Russian. People spoke Russian to me. Sometimes they speak Russian and Ukrainian. It's like famous Ukrainians can do this in the East. In the same sentence, they'll speak Ukrainian and Russian. They're not the same language. I'm learning Ukrainian now. They're not the same language. So that's kind of the history of the imperial pre-1914 part of Eastern Ukraine. Western Ukraine is part of Austria-Hungary. They didn't have the same problems of the repression of Ukrainian nationalism. They were able to speak Ukrainian, write in Ukrainian. They also have a very unique religious mix in terms of the Uniate Church. And so you have an Eastern Orthodox Church that follows the Eastern Orthodox rites, but it follows the rulings in the leadership of the Pope. And that's a very unique mixture in Ukraine because of this connection between Orthodoxy, but in the Catholic Austro-Hungarian Empire. So before 1939, really, you don't see the united Ukraine we have now. You don't really see that until 1939, because the Western part for the longest time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then after the Austro-Hungarian Empire falls after World War I, it becomes part of Poland. So the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is key to this story because in this pact, you have the Soviets agreeing with the Nazis to invade Poland. And that's when we see that part of Western Ukraine becoming joined to the east, is because of the Soviet invasion in 1939.
Oh, interesting. I didn't realize that. And so then it becomes part of the then Soviet Union at that point. And as it becomes part of the Soviet Union, it is not it's not a chartered country at that point, right? It becomes more a region of the Soviet Union, or how did that work?
So this is special. The Soviet Union is officially established in 1922. And one of the reasons why you have this ethno-federal state is because of Ukraine. So the Soviets knew that they couldn't really have a powerful economy without the breadbasket, the Black Earth region of Ukraine. So the only way they could get this to work is to promote Ukrainian nationalism. So that's why you have the creation of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And so the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, I can't say USSR because then it'll get even more confusing. It is part of the Soviet Union, and it's probably the second most powerful of the Soviet Socialist Republics, Russia being the most powerful. So when the West is conjoined to the East, it becomes part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And so that's really the first time we see West and East Ukraine that we see today fully connected. But Crimea is not part of this yet. It's not part of Ukraine until 1954.
Okay. And at what point does Stalin come in and says, and you know, you have a breadbasket, you have a lot of farmers, you have farmers who tend to, at least in my experience still in this country, very much in rural areas, you get a different relationship to the land, and the idea of collectivizing land becomes a little bit problematic. Stalin doesn't want that. What does Stalin do and when?
This is a great question. It's also the topic of my master's thesis.
Oh, well, I've asked the right person then.
So the first 5-year plan begins in 1928. So you have two parts. You have the forced collectivization of agriculture, which is Stalin's view necessary to get as much grain exports as possible to fund vast and very quick industrialization. So these two pieces go hand in hand in Stalin's 5-year plan. The problem is collectivization is hugely unpopular. I mean, it's particularly in Ukraine and in the I'm trying to remember the word in English, the Black Earth region. So what happens is you have the initial push into the Ukrainian countryside by the Bolsheviks. They have this thing called the 25,000ers. So there are a lot of young Komsomol volunteers who go to the countryside to try to create collectivized farms. And unsurprisingly, they're not very successful. And one of my favorite things about my thesis work and research is reading the peasants and how they're reacting. They're like beating up these guys. They're like stealing their stuff and they're yelling at them. So like you see the video now of like the Ukrainian woman shaming the Russian soldier, like put these sunflower seeds in your pocket. That goes all the way back. We have, similar stories of them realizing the Bolsheviks don't know anything about agriculture. So yeah,
the analog today would be if you go into a rural area coming from a city, you're referred to as a cidiot, and
yes,
there's that quality, right? Okay, so this is yes.
And so the response is by the Soviet government, well, if they're not going to join on their own, we'll make them join. And so one of the key things here is, I think, so when we think about the Holodomor, which is what it's called in Ukrainian, death by hunger, the famine that ensues in 1932-33 is a state-made famine. The Bolsheviks send in Komsomol activists, and so what they do is they take so much grain, there is no food left. And millions of people starve to death. And so this happens in eastern Ukraine particularly, but throughout Ukraine, as famine happens, it happens in the southern region of Russia near the Don Basin, but also it happens in Kazakhstan. So you have this process, and it looks different across these three regions. But in Ukraine, not only was it the collectivization of agriculture, peasants were some of the most staunch Ukrainian nationalists. Because many of them remember when they were part of the Russian Empire and they couldn't speak their language. They were taught in their language. So they want to maintain Ukrainian culture and use Ukrainian language. So they see the Soviet forces through collectivization as yet another imposition upon them. And so millions of people die. And what I argue in my thesis is that this was part of the subjectivizing process. This is how Stalin turned the Ukrainian countryside into Soviet subjects. Because after 1933, once the famine dissipates and they start releasing more grain to the peasantry, you don't see huge uprisings in the countryside again. Before that, there were tons of uprisings, lots of violence towards Bolshevik activists in the collective farms. But after this, the majority of the farms are collectivized, and you don't really see that uproar in the countryside again.
What? I mean, what is that? Just simply like people? Is that a function of people have taken a beating, or that when you have that level of conflict, the people who are most inclined to revolt are killed, imprisoned, weeded out, essentially? Is it that the deaths of those people just simply dissipates their collective power to respond in that instance? I mean, what are the factors that change the disposition? I mean, to subjectivize them, as you say.
I think it's a mixture of all the points you've made. And so what you see, and it's really heartbreaking. So in my thesis, I look at peasantry. I look at people who were part of the intelligentsia before the Russian Revolution in 1917, and I look at communist activists. And so the peasants, they learn that if they continue to fight, they're going to keep starving. So in a way, they just accept that collectivization is happening. But also, they lose so many people. They literally do not have the strength to fight. The intelligentsia is interesting because the people I've studied, their diaries, they have this crisis of faith. They have this crisis, this existential crisis of what does it mean to be a person who still has food, but to watch everyone around you starve to death. And so a lot of them, like, they become depressed. Some of them turn to suicide because there's no way for them to, like, reconcile the position that they're in. But the communist activists tend to go in two groups. One, either they become gung-ho, communists, and their birth by fire has forged them as, complete Stalinist supporters, or the other half, and so many of them, they end up turning away, or they continue to be part of the Communist Party because that's the only way to get ahead. But many of them are victims of the purges in 1936, 1937. So they're imprisoned, they're sent to Siberia, they're killed. So I think it is a combination of things. But what I argue for the peasantry is that the famine broke the key means of survival in the countryside, which is, reciprocity and subsistence. And because their subsistence was taken away from them, the role of reciprocity in the village commune was destroyed. So, like, irreparable harm was done to the interpersonal connections. And so when that happens, you can't depend on your neighbor, so you must depend on the state, if that makes sense.
It does. And how much of that era remains in the public consciousness today or a week ago, when you were there?
It's huge, mostly because this is something people weren't able to talk about until the collapse of the Soviet Union. So 1991, you have, the creation of the independent Ukrainian state, but it's only been about the last 12, 15 years that the Holodomor has become part of the Ukrainian national consciousness. It's been added to textbooks. We have a Holodemour Memorial. And so for the first time, like when I was there in 2013, I was talking to people about my research and I said, my grandmother remembers that. My grandpa remembers that. My parents remember that. And it was the first time their parents and grandparents had talked about these experiences. There's a lot of shame for people who survived because there was also widespread reports of cannibalism. So, like, it's a very complicated process for Ukrainians to go through. And what I have seen, like, I read Ukrainian, I speak and read Russian. I'm learning how to speak Ukrainian. Now we're seeing more instances of, look at what they did to us in 1932-33 because of the images we're seeing in Ukraine now, where cities that are encircled are starting to run out of food. So this is very much part of the national memory, and they're bringing it up right now, for sure, on the ground in Ukraine.
That's fascinating. I mean, it's almost like their version of the Dunning School, I guess, on some level, or a slightly different dynamic now. But there seems to be a reawakened awareness of it, and poorly timed, at least relative to what I think the expectations were of Putin.